So how do you reason amongst things in life? Like if somebody comes up to you with a scientific argument, how
Right.
do you assess that if it's not in the Bible?
Well, if it comports with Scripture, I have no problem with it. Science is a gift from God. But if it doesn't comport with Scripture, if it tries to contradict what's in Scripture, if a scientist comes to me and say, well, this proves that the Bible's not true, I say, well, what's truth without God? And I say, this scientific experiment, you need the truth of Scripture in order to do science. I'm not saying you have to acknowledge that Scripture is true, but unless you can account for the uniformity of nature, science makes no sense. So you cannot take the justification for science and contradict it with science. Because science can prove a lot of things, but you know what it can't prove?
Itself?
The validity of science. For that you need God. So any science that contradicts God contradicts its very foundation. It makes no sense.
So if it is in accordance with the Scripture,
Yeah, then I have no
so,
problem
so
with it.
say so two opposing scientific views come up to you, and they're both in accordance with Scripture,
Right.
would you assess that on earthly means? And if you did that, would that now make you the
No, no, the
judge?
thing is, you have to keep in mind, though, and let me explain that to you, because God has given us senses and reasoning. There are people who say you can only know that which is in Scripture, and I deny that. Because one of the things that Scripture says is, thou shalt not steal. How can I obey that command unless I can know for certain what is my car? And for that, I need my senses and my reasoning. But I can only justify their validity if I appeal to God. So there are things that God grants us as senses and reasoning in order to justify. If there's two opposing scientific theories that are not at all mentioned in Scripture, I use my senses and my reasoning. I do experiments. I try to find out. But once it doesn't agree with Scripture, then I know something's wrong.
So it's really simple. Somebody's going to ask you, how do you know this one's right? And you'll explain your logical reasoning behind it. Let's say you came to the conclusion, and you
Right.
were certain that this was the right. They would ask you why. You'd give them your logical reasoning. They'd say, well, how do you know your reasoning is right? And you'd say, because God granted it to me.
Right.
And then that would be sufficient because you validated your reasoning, and your reasoning validated your conclusion.
Yeah, but the thing is, I would be very leery to say something as certain that is not contained within Scripture. Like, I don't mind saying that I'm certain that this is my car. I can say that. That's not in Scripture. But if it's a scientific experiment that's out there, that has a lot of theory behind it and stuff like that, I'm not going to say I'm certain about it. I'll say that makes the most sense. But I think that people, go too far in that degree. Because, people ask me, am I certain the sun will come up tomorrow? No, I'm not. God could
Right.
perform a miracle, but based on induction, which God has given us, and based on His promises, I have a reasonable expectation to assume that the sun will come up tomorrow. The unbeliever has zero basis for that assumption. Zero.
Right. So any type of knowledge whatsoever will lead back to God. And once you have God, then you can have a justification for reasoning in the first place, and that allows
Right.
you to continue reasoning
Exactly.
in non-godly topics.
That's right, because He's but the thing is, there is no non-godly topic.
Okay, well, I see how that can be argued. But I
Yeah,
mean,
no, but the thing is, God has His hand in everything, and every thought, every fact that you reason about cannot be made sense of without God. So I
I'd
see
say
what you mean, if you're talking about swimming pools.
non-scriptural,
What's that?
like non-explicitly scriptural
Yeah, I
topics.
know what you mean. If you're talking about swimming pools, you say it's a non-God topic, but really, everything you think, say, and do involves God. But I know what you mean, though. But
Yeah.
yeah, we can reason about other things all the time. And it's the Christians that actually are the heads of all these fields of scientists if you look back in history. It's because Christians understood the uniformity of nature that they can know things in science, that they were the heads of these different fields of science. I mean, just look at your history books.
You mean the
Like Newton and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Christian.
Newton was a Christian.
Right. But you probably haven't listened to any of my debates. And I'm just, like I say, a dude with a website. You listen to that debate and you can see the foolishness of the unbelievers. I had one guy in my first debate, actually, that's on my website. He said to me, there is no certainty. And I said, are you certain about that?
What the hell?
And he just started laughing. I mean, and that is the folly of unbelief. And, that's why when I deal with people, I try to be kind, but I say, look, man, this discussion doesn't make sense according to your worldview. You have to borrow from mine. And if you grant that, sure, I'll talk about morality. I'll talk about science. I have no problem with that. But you're borrowing from my worldview when you do it. And I make that clear.